Hello, everybody, and welcome. Thank you for joining me for A Little Bird Told Me, using bird language to enhance student learning. My name is Brooke Ahlegian, and I've been an outdoor educator for over 15 years. I've had the great pleasure of working for a number of really amazing organizations like Wilderness Awareness School and the National Park Service. And in addition, I have founded two of my own nature school programs here in Washington State. Um, Bringing nature connection to children is my biggest passion, and so I'm really pleased to have a chance to share some of my tips and tricks with all of you. And I hope that this will enable you to feel really empowered to also share your own love of nature with all of the children that you're able to teach. So before we get started, I do want to acknowledge that the land that I'm working on is land that is of the Duwamish tribe and the Coast Salish tribes. I'm very privileged to be living and working here on this land, and I just wanted to start by acknowledging that. So bird language is such an incredible tool, and it's something that you may or may not have heard very much about. Some people are very familiar with the idea that birds have different types of sounds that they make. So they have, a song and a call, which often refers to their alarm. And so this is something that, is kind of a basic level understanding of bird language. But the more that you get into it and develop a deeper understanding of it, you'll actually find that you're able to really understand what the birds might be communicating about out in nature around you. And so in this webinar, we're going to talk about some ways that you can understand what the birds are talking about, and then how you can bring that to your students through some activities that I've developed, which not only are really fun for developing that deeper nature connection, but they're also great for addressing some early literacy standards, developing empathy, and a whole bunch of really great benefits. So I'm very pleased to be able to share that with you all. I wanted to share a story of how I became particularly interested in bird language, just to kind of get a little inspiration flowing. So when I was a teenager, I was attending a program much like the one that I teach right now, and I learned about the concept of bird language. And I was super intrigued about the idea that not only could I understand what the birds were talking about, but that they could potentially tell me things about my surroundings that I wasn't aware of myself. And so, as I started to learn different calls that the birds would make and different sounds and patterns to watch out for, I happened to be inside my house and I heard some really loud alarms, mainly from crows and Steller's jays out in my yard. And I heard the birds sounding really agitated. And so I thought, oh, I wonder what they are so upset about. So I went out to my yard to investigate. And I looked up into the tree where all of these sounds were coming from. And sure enough, from the tree jumped a lynx, very similar to a bobcat. And that lynx looked me right in the eyes and then carried on to my neighbor's yard. And I was blown away by the fact that the birds were able to point something out to me that I otherwise would have never seen. Only a few days later, I heard the birds alarming in that same part of the yard. So I hurried back out there thinking, oh, I'll have another chance to see this lynx. And not only did I see the lynx, but I also saw its little baby. And it was just the size of a little kitten. It was one of the coolest things that I've ever been able to see. And that's just one of so many examples of how paying attention to the birds can actually deepen your connection to your surroundings and enable you to be aware of things that you would have otherwise missed. So I think that's just such a cool thing about bird language. And I would encourage all of you to practice this yourselves in your own lives outside of teaching, so that you might have a story like that to share with your own students to help them get really inspired. So before we get into the process of bird language and understanding what you might be hearing outside, I just want to start by talking about a few reasons that we might want to teach bird language with children. So for one thing, I like to work with the principle of child passions. This is something that you can read a little bit more about in the Coyote's Guide to Mentoring, written by John Young, Ellen Haas, and Evan McGowan. It's an incredible guide of outdoor education activities, as well as the philosophies behind them. And one of those philosophies is child passions, essentially just meaning that we want to conduct activities that are already exciting and engaging for the kids and the things that they want to do. One of those things is watching and interacting with wildlife. And so, by watching the birds, by paying attention to them, and also by understanding that they might enable us to see other cool wildlife, that really sparks passion in the children. And they are so excited to do anything that involves interacting with other living creatures and with animals. I mean, it's just so exciting. So, by taking an activity that the kids are already excited about, it just makes it a really engaging way um, to learn. Another reason that this is such a cool activity is because it helps with auditory processing. So this is great for kids with, sensory processing issues, but it's also just great for everybody. Um, Paying attention to the birds enables you to do so many things that benefit auditory processing, such as noticing which direction sounds are coming from, noticing the distance that sounds are coming from, different volumes. Some bird calls can be quite loud, others are extremely faint and quiet. And so, all of these different things that are naturally present with birds are also things that a lot of occupational therapists tend to utilize for kids who need a little bit more help with their auditory processing. And so this is just a great way that we can really benefit all of the children that we're teaching by giving them these opportunities to engage with different levels of sounds, different pitches, all sorts of things that are just great for that development. Another thing that I think is just fantastic is that this process of listening to and understanding the birds can really help children develop empathy. Birds, they have many similar challenges to us as humans, but they also have some really unique challenges. So in addition to, needing to have shelter and water and food, which is similar to all of us, they also have a great deal of predators that are always out to get them. One particularly notable one is the Cooper's hawk, who is a type of hawk who only eats other birds. And so Cooper's hawks are quite common, particularly in North America. And so often birds will be communicating about, these real life predators. This is not something that, humans can necessarily relate to on that same level, but for children to understand what a bird might be scared of, and to understand that perspective of another living thing can really help them develop that sense of empathy. Similarly, understanding the things that make the birds happy, like when you water the plants with a misting hose, it'll often cause all the birds to come around and kind of splash around in the water. And, observing something like that can be so enlivening for students, who get to watch the birds kind of being silly and fun. And they can relate to birds on that level of, they also like to play in the hose. So there's so many ways that this process can help develop empathy, which, I think for those of us who are early childhood educators, that might not be something that's explicitly written in our educational standards or objectives, but it is an objective I think that most of us share. We want these kids to grow up to be empathetic and caring and compassionate. And I think that interacting with wildlife and thinking about, what the wildlife might be experiencing is just one additional way that we can develop that skill. This process is also incredible for early literacy. So there's ways that, and I'll kind of go into all of the details of exactly how this activity works and how you can build on it over several months with your class. But by doing this activity, you can develop a lot of phonetic understanding. You can develop understanding of reading and writing that goes from left to right and top to bottom. You can develop an understanding of beginning, middle, and end of a story. And so this ends up actually meeting a whole bunch of Common Core standards, a whole bunch of early literacy literacy standards, and I'll actually provide you with some materials that can match this activity directly with, some Common Core standards that you might be working with, particularly if you're working with kindergarten through third grade students. Um, it also helps with recalling events in chronological order. This is something that I'll talk a little bit more about as we get into, what the activity really consists of. But as you know, that's another great process for kids to be practicing. In addition to helping with early literacy, it's just a great brain development activity to be able to recall and say, first this happened, then that happened. And of course, one of the greatest benefits of all of this is a deepened connection to nature. So, really pleased to be able to share this activity and hope that your students will be able to get some of these benefits, if not all of these benefits, through you adapting some kind of practice of bird language into your own classroom as you see fit. One thing I also love about this work is that there are birds almost everywhere we go. So whether you're teaching in a forest or a desert or, in a quite urban area, all of these settings have great bird life. And so this is something that you can do even just in your schoolyard. You don't need to be out in the wilderness. This is something that can happen pretty much anywhere, even just outside of a window. So I hope that this will be something that you find accessible to do with your own students. So without further ado, let's talk about doing a bird sit. This is the main activity that all of this is kind of based around. And there are 4 different levels that I'm going to talk to you about. And each level kind of builds upon the last level. So the first one that we're going to start with is the egg level. Of course, all of the levels are named after stages of a bird's life. And so the egg level is pretty simple. And it just involves doing a nature sit or a sit spot, depending on if you've, looked into other practices of environmental education. This might be something that you're familiar with. But the basic premise of this is that we want the students to go have a spot where they sit in nature. They observe everything that's around them. And it's really as simple as that. However, I do want to add, a couple tips and tricks that I've picked up over the years, because the setup of this level of the activity is actually really an important foundation. So beyond just doing a nature sit, there's a few really important key elements to that. One of them is that you want the students to be spread out as far as possible. So the idea would be that, in an ideal world, they would each have their own spot where they can't see any other students. This isn't always possible given, restraints of space as well as, limited teacher supervision. And so you might need to have the students in closer proximity. But even if that's the case, you can try to have them facing away from each other so that they aren't distracted by each other and they're having a more immersive nature experience. One of the most important elements of this as well is setting a really strong boundary with the students that they do not come back to you until they are called back. This can be particularly challenging for students, 5 and under. And that's why this level is really important to practice that skill, because this is going to kind of come up again in future levels of this activity. So what I do with my students is that they will go to their sit spot, they'll sit down, and they won't return until they hear a crow call, which sounds like this. Oh, oh. Of course, you can choose any kind of call that works for you. It helps if it's something that is loud enough to carry over a large area, particularly if the students are spread out kind of far. So this can be a real challenge for them to not come back until they're called, but it's really important for them to practice this, not only because if they're, getting up a lot and coming to talk to you or going to talk to their friends, it will definitely take away from that experience and disturb the wildlife that's around them. But also because this is good practice for what's coming up next. The other really important aspect of this is that after they do their sit spot and they all come back after you've made your call and welcomed them to come back, You want to make sure that you provide a really good opportunity for them to share what they got to see or experience. At this point, it does not have to do anything with birds. It can, but if they saw a roly-poly or a worm, or if they saw a leaf falling from a tree, or if they, just watched the wind pass by, or if they heard a truck drive by on the road or an airplane, like any and all of it is great. Because what we want to foster here is for the students to be excited to share what they've experienced when they come back. So whatever it is, you want to give them that positive feedback and show curiosity about what they experienced, so that they'll feel when they go out to the sit spot like, ooh, I want to notice something so that I can come back and tell my teacher and my class what I saw. We want that part to feel really rewarding for them, because once again, that is something that gets built upon. So that is the egg level. It's really quite simple and really fun. And you will find that, the more that you learn about outdoor education, you'll see this sit spot activity in almost every book and recommended by almost every outdoor educator. Regardless of any content relating to birds, it's just an incredible way to connect with nature. And it can be really joyful, even for the kids who struggle the most to maybe sit still and focus. Something like this, enables them to kind of self-regulate. They can, fidget with a stick or a pine cone on the ground. They can, scrape a rock against another rock, or different things like that to kind of self-regulate. And as long as they are staying in their spot, all of that is totally okay for them to experience it however they want to experience it. So that is the egg level. The next level, and these are all things that I have developed based on the work of John Young. So if you're interested in going a little bit deeper in this work, I highly recommend the book called What a Robin Knows, and that's by John Young. He also has a great set of tapes that explain the concepts of bird language, and he is who I directly learned all of this from. And then I took what he teaches, which is for adults, and I've adapted it to fit in an early childhood education. So that's where these different levels are coming from that I'm talking about, and where this specific activity has come from. Is that something that I've developed based on the works of John Young? So the next level, level 2, is the hatchling level. This is where it gets really fun. So now when the students go out for their sit spot, they get to bring a paper and a pencil, and they get to take notes. This might look a little different depending on the age of your students, but I have developed this with pre-literate students in mind. So one of the concepts that I really like to work with is spectrogram style notes. So a spectrogram is a device that records pitch over time. So if you download an app like Merlin Bird ID is one of my favorites, from the Cornell Lab of Ornithology. And you play, the bird call sounds that are on that app, they'll often come with, a shape that looks kind of like a scribble, or like what a lie detector test might look like. And that comes from a spectrogram. But we are able to make our own spectrogram style notes kind of informally, just by paying attention to the sounds that we're hearing. So when you hear a bird call, it will have different pitch, it'll have different speeds that you hear it at, and you can draw a shape that represents that sound that you hear. There's no right or wrong way to do this. And, if you have one bird call, you might see 5 different students draw it 5 different ways. And that's totally great, because the object is to help remember what that sounded like for the individual who's taking the notes. So that's a really fun thing to get to work with, because, there really is no correct answer. It's more just a tool. So in a moment, I'm going to show you a video that goes a little bit more into the process of taking those spectrogram style notes. But before I do, I want to just tell you another type of note that you can take, which would be phonetic notes. So this, for instance, would look like using the sounds that the children are able to understand, letter sounds that they might be familiar with, to also record what they're hearing. So how I see this is, you'll hear a chickadee, right? And the chickadee says chickadee dee dee. And you might have kids write, CHK and then the letter D, 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 D. And, of course, this is invented spelling, which can address some other standards. But this is a really fun process because you get to see the kids' understanding of phonetics kind of unfold. And so this is another option. And of course, I love a combination of the two. This is what I usually do with my students, where I teach them how to make spectrogram style notes. And I also encourage them to use phonetic notes and just kind of a combination of the two. So I have actually a couple pictures that I'd love to show you here. One of them is these notes. These are notes that were created by my students. And these are some spectrogram style notes. So you can see here that there were a variety of different sounds. Some of them were more even tone, like this one here might be like a D, 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 D. You have also some kind of squiggly ones that might be sort of a more sing-songy kind of bird, like a song sparrow, kind of a. You've also got some really stark up and down notes here, which is really interesting to see. And this looks like sort of a trill. There's some birds that sound kind of like a referee whistle, and that's kind of how I imagine this shape looking. But the really fun thing about this is that if I were to ask this student, oh, what did that? If I pointed to one and I said, oh, what did that one sound like? I am confident that she'd be able to describe or imitate exactly what it sounded like. Imitating bird calls is another really fun process that I hope you get to experiment with. I don't touch too much on that in this webinar, but it is something that's really fun, and it really deepens children's understanding of these different bird calls. So that's really fun. Here's an example of some phonetic style notes. So you can see that this student was seeing a lot of E, 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 and things like that. And, so this is just, a quick little example. I've got just a couple more that I want to show you here. Here is a combination of some phonetic and some spectrogram style notes. The co is actually a caw. You've got some little which might be like a and you've got some little squiggles, and this really interesting one that the student has repeated several times with kind of a bigger intonation change at the beginning and then sort of a trill at the end. I just think it's so fun to look at these notes that the students create and how they interpret these different bird calls. It's just absolutely fascinating to me. So these are just some examples of what their notes might look like. Those notes that I just showed you were all created by, 5 and 6-year-olds for the most part, and some 4-year-olds. So, you can expect that different ages will create different types of notes. I've found that that's a really great age for being able to focus on this particular activity. This is another one with a little bit of a combination. The student was more interested in doing phonetic notes, but you can see there's a few spectrogram style notes mixed in there as well. And whatever this one is down here at the bottom between caw and wah wah wah, that's more wah wah wah. That I'm so curious what that particular bird was saying. So interesting. So now I'm just going to show you a video. And for this video, I'd love to encourage you to actually grab a piece of paper and a pen if you don't already have one, because I designed this to be a bit interactive just to help you get a taste of what this process might feel like. So, feel free to pause this for a moment, run and get that paper and pen if you don't already have one. And then I'm going to pull this video up. So this is going to be a virtual bird sit. And this is going to utilize kind of the different processes that we just talked about for the hatchling level. So here we are. All right, there we have it. So hopefully you had a chance to jot down, a few spectrogram style notes along with that video. It could even be really fun to, go back and listen to that video again and see if you picked up on anything that you missed the first time. There's even a few human sounds mixed in there. There was a little bit of chatter of someone who walked by on the path and things like that. So it can be kind of fun to see, what it is that you notice. And anything that you notice is a great thing to add to the notes because you might oftentimes people would consider human noises to be sort of impure or something that you might not add to a nature observation, but in the case of bird language, the birds could actually be responding to the fact that there's people walking down the path. This is something that could set off a small bird alarm, and so things like that can actually help you put together a whole story of what's happening, which is really fun. So hopefully you had a chance to try out some little spectrogram style notes there with that video. That video was taken in Duval, Washington, which is just such a gorgeous place. So, in case you were curious. So, the next level of this bird sit is the fledgling level. And this part involves the beginning, middle, and end of a story. So, when we are doing the fledgling level, what we want to do is divide the bird sit up into 3 parts. And the way that I generally do that with my students is say we're going out for a 15-minute bird sit, right? Which is something that we may have worked up to. We might have started with a 5-minute nature sit, and then we might have moved on to a 10-minute sit where we take notes about the birds. And now we're, on to this next level. So if we're doing a 15-minute bird sit, I would break it into 3 5-minute sections. This is another one where you'll need to be able to have some kind of loud sound that carries, because what you'll do is you'll tell your students that after the beginning of the story is done, then you will send out a call. I like to do something different than my ending call. So, I told you that I use a crow call for the end of the bird sit. I would probably use a different kind of bird call, maybe a peacock call, to signify that this is the end of the beginning of the story. After that part, they will draw a line on their paper underneath their notes so that everything above the line was the beginning of the story, and everything below that line is now the middle of the story. For 5 more minutes, they'll take a few more notes, and then they'll hear another call. They'll draw another line, and then that bottom section of their paper would be the end of the story. So making those calls just enables everybody to have the same timing for the beginning, middle, and end of the story. There is a reason for that, which you will find out about in the next level. But for now, I'm just going to leave it at that. So, this one, I only have one picture to show you because the notes are quite similar. But the paper, as you can see, is divided into 3 sections. This one is a particularly creative note taker. And a very busy note taker, which is so cool. But you can see you've got the top part here, the beginning of the story, a line, and then you've got the middle part here, another line, and then you've got the end of the story. I also love how this particular student used some illustration. There's a bit of some birds flying over here at the bottom. There's some swirls, which I'm not sure exactly what those might be conveying, but using illustration is just another great way to do this practice, because the idea is to be able to retell a story of what happened. So just like in the egg level, where the students are coming back after their nature sit and they're telling you about what they heard and experienced, this is part of the process for the whole thing. So, at this point, they're coming back and you can ask prompting questions like, okay, what did you hear during the beginning of the story? And then they're having to look back to that part of their notes. So this can be a little higher level, for some of your younger students. But looking back to that part of their notes and saying, oh, I heard a bird that was going, chickadee during the beginning. And so, it's a great way of also, recalling events in chronological order, and learning that process of beginning, middle, and end of the story, which can actually hit quite a few of those early literacy standards. So for this part, there's also a few other ways that we can kind of level this up. And this is something that you can kind of take at your own pace depending on how much your students are really taking to this. One of them is isolating species. So it might be a great idea to learn what are the kind of key species in your area that you are somewhat guaranteed to hear or see. For many of us, that might be the American robin, who is just everywhere, a very, very common bird here. And the American robin, you can get to know its different calls. So another thing that's really fun is to use mnemonics. And mnemonics are basically, human words that we can use to help us remember what a bird call sounds like. So with the American robin, when they are happy, their song goes, cheer up, cheerio, cheer up, cheerio. And when they are distressed, their alarm call goes, chitata, chitata. As well as some other variations as well. Robins say more things than just those two things, but those are things, that you can hear quite a lot. So getting to know those different species, with the chickadee, this is another great one for mnemonics, because that call that you heard in the first video that the spectrogram notes were being made off of, where it was, people often say that sounds like it's saying, free cheeseburger, free cheeseburger. And that's its song. And then, of course, its alarm is chickadee dee dee. One really fun fact about this is that chickadees will alter the number of D's that they say at the end of their call, depending on how distressed they are. So if they're just a little bit scared, they'll say chickadee dee. But if they're extremely scared, they'll say chickadee dee 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 dee. So that's kind of a cool thing to know about. And kids in particular really enjoy that fact about chickadees. It's really fun. So, these are some things that are also present in this next level where, you're starting to get to know what birds are actually in your area, in your schoolyard, or wherever it is that you're doing this bird sit activity. And then being able to identify them based on their call or their song. It's actually, being able to identify individual bird calls is probably the least important aspect of this activity. Because you can get a lot more from thinking about, overall bird calls, which I'll talk to you about in the next level. But it can still be really fun to get to know those individual species, and it can really enhance that learning experience. And in addition, that can lead to, all kinds of other things like doing, little reports about particular bird species that you've been seeing a lot of and things like that. It can really make that experience come to life by being able to know exactly who it is that you're seeing, and then maybe look at pictures of that bird and learn what that bird's particular diet is and things like that. Can really make it quite interesting. So in this next video, this is the fledgling level. So we've gone from egg to hatchling to fledgling. And so in this video, you'll see, all of those themes highlighted. So let me pull up that next video here. Oh, I'm sorry, excuse me, this is the wrong video. There we are. Okay. Thanks for bearing with me there. right, there we are. So one thing that is, really fun about this is that as this develops and as they're having the beginning, middle, and end of the story, you can actually ask them things like how many how many red-winged blackbirds did you hear during the middle of the story? How many did you hear during the end of the story? And see, what they're able to come up with. Um, Part of this process that makes it so fun is the ability to ask kids questions. Um, in a bit, I'll show you a little bit of footage of me actually asking the kids some questions after one of their bird sits. And so you'll be able to hear kind of some of the types of questions that I might ask. But there's so many ways that you can take this questioning, and really just paying attention to what the kids are the most excited about. Regardless of what direction the conversation takes, this activity is still meeting tons of standards. So you can be kind of free form about it. You can allow it to flow in the way that the kids seem to want it to flow, which makes this just a really fun and also relaxing activity to be able to do. um, Another thing I just wanted to point out is that in the beginning of that video you may have noticed a worksheet, and just at the front, and that worksheet will be available to you at the end of this webinar. I will explain how you can access all of these different materials, lesson plans, etc., that I've developed. So you'll have a chance to be able to download all of those things so that you can use them with your own class, if you so choose. So that is a really fun thing. The other thing that I remembered I wanted to mention was that if you're interested in mnemonics, because they can be such a fun way to teach these bird calls to your students, there's a really fun comic. So if you search Bird and Moon comics, they have a mnemonics comic, and it's just a page of illustrations of different birds and their mnemonics. So it might have, a chickadee sitting with a cheeseburger, and it would say cheeseburger, or a California quail saying Chicago, Chicago. So if you're into those mnemonics, it can be a really fun way to bring it to life with the kids. And then you can even download a free app like the Merlin Bird ID app that I mentioned before. And you can, play those calls so that the kids can hear how the mnemonic might reflect what the bird call actually sounds like. So that can be a fun little activity to do as well, just to enhance this whole process. So now on to the final level. This is the soaring level. So we've gone from egg to hatchling to fledgling and now to soaring. So I'm actually going to divert a little bit from this process, because now is the point in the webinar in which I want to explain some of the different themes that you'll see, common voices of the birds and common bird language that you might hear. So I'm going to pull up these symbols. And this is something that I have developed because when you are taking notes outside with, trying to pay attention to the birds, things are happening really fast. You might have even noticed that as you've been doing these little virtual bird sits. That you're trying to, write down something that you heard, and you've already heard, two or three more things. It goes really fast, especially for children who are just learning how to write and trying to control that pencil, and so rather than having them try to write words or draw pictures to convey something they've observed, I've actually developed 10 symbols that they can use that are really easy to draw, but can tell a much bigger story about what they may have observed. So that's where this came from. These different voices of the birds came from John Young's work, and then I developed the symbols to go along with them to make it easier for kids to take these notes. So to begin, we have the 5 voices of the birds, and these are the most common things that you will hear the birds doing. The first one is baseline, which is their song. And so, when you wake up in the morning and you hear the birds singing as the sun rises, this is an example of baseline and their song. But there's other types of baseline behaviors that you also might experience, such as, a robin hopping along in the grass looking for worms. You can tell when you're watching this that the bird is not agitated, is not fearful. It's alert and aware, but it's comfortable. And so this would be an example of baseline behavior. And so when you hear the birds singing, you know that they are in baseline, because they wouldn't be singing if there was a predator around. because they wouldn't want to draw attention to themselves. Often the purpose of a bird's song is actually to draw attention to themselves. They make their songs to convey their territory. So often when I'm explaining this to the kids and describing what the birds might be singing about, I describe them singing, "This is my nest. This is my tree," because that's often what they're singing about. They're actually very territorial creatures, so that's something that you might experience. But some people say that they're also just singing because they're happy to be alive. They're happy that they made it through another night and didn't get eaten. Being eaten is a true daily, multiple times daily threat for a bird, and so they really could be expressing gratitude to be alive as well. And so we represent that with a little song note. The next one is companion calling. And this is a really cool one when you get to experience it. It can be a little harder to spot. So you have to be, sitting still for quite a while before you'll actually see the birds conducting this kind of behavior. But companion calling is when you have two birds who are mates, and they will call back and forth to one another to make sure that they are safe while they're, looking for food or nesting materials. And they'll often make a pretty subtle, quiet call. So it might just be like a chip, 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 chip between two birds. That one, of course, is represented with a heart because the birds are companions. And it just kind of conveys that message of, two birds calling back and forth to each other. For the purposes of children, they might not be able to discern whether something is a true companion call behavior, but that's less important, because what is important is that they're observing two birds communicating, and they are imagining that that's what it could be, and they're recording that as part of their story. And the more that they practice, the more that they can become aware of what's really truly happening. I'll often see kids put companion calling in their notes when there was no actual companion calling happening. But that's totally okay, as long as they are paying attention to what's happening and trying to make a story of it and trying to make meaning of what they observed, then that really is excellent. Accuracy is not always the most important thing with young children in particular. So that's just something to keep in mind. Number 3 here, we have territorial aggression. This one is really fun. And often you will see two birds fighting. Generally, it would be two male birds, and they would be fighting over physical territory, or they might be fighting over another bird that they both want to have as their mate. And so I've represented this one with an X, to be sort of like two swords, clashing against each other. And this one, is very loud. So, companion calling might be like a chip, 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 chip coming from a tree. And it might sound, like a very agitated, very alarmed kind of a bird call, because it is an alarm of sorts. The 4th one we have is juvenile begging. And this one is represented by a little bird beak with a worm going into it, but made into as simple of a symbol as possible so that the kids can draw it pretty quickly. This will typically be experienced in the springtime. And one thing that's really fun to know about this is that the baby birds will be very quiet when their parents are gone. They'll only act up and start peeping and begging for food when they've noticed that their parent is close by. The reason for this is that there are so many predators out there, and a baby bird that can't yet fly is an easy target. And so they know to be very quiet unless they have their parents around to protect them, which I think is a really interesting thing. And I think kids really understand that concept really well. So that's an important thing to know about that. And the 5th one, with the exclamation point there, is alarm. Not only is that an easy symbol to draw, but it also kind of teaches a little bit of basics of punctuation. If that's something that they're not super familiar with yet, then they might, learn for the first time that an exclamation mark means, excitement in that sentence. So an alarm, is often seen if there's a a true predator like a Cooper's hawk or a bobcat, but alarms are also used for things that the birds perceive as threats. So a person walking their dog down the path will set off a bird alarm, or even just a person walking down the path. There's all kinds of things that can cause the birds to alarm. Neighborhood cats, which could definitely be a threat. Things like that. And so those bird alarms, paying attention to them, can really help you kind of see what's going on around you. And it can also help you see how the birds are reacting to you, which is kind of a higher level aspect of the bird language process. But once kids start to realize, oh, those birds might be alarming at me, then maybe they'll practice moving a little bit more slowly and quietly. Or they might practice, thinking calm and happy thoughts instead of, thoughts about, I want to catch that bird. Little things like that can actually make a pretty big difference in how the birds respond to you. And that's something that I practice with my students is going into the woods. This is something that John Young refers to in his book as the cloak of invisibility, which of course kids love. It kind of plays on some Harry Potter themes. But, you know, walking into the woods in a state of mind that's really calm will actually help the birds respond more calmly to you. So that's a really fun thing to play with. One side note is that these 5 voices of the birds make excellent skits if you want to do like a class play. You can act out each different type of bird voice that you would see here, and the kids can act out, what baseline looks like. They can act out what alarm looks like, and it kind of helps bring it all to life for them. So that can be really fun. After these 5 voices of the birds, and after they've come to understand what alarm is, there's actually 5 shapes of alarm that I also have symbols for here. So this is a little bit more advanced, and this is something that I wouldn't necessarily expect to happen quickly. This is something that I usually introduce to my students after they've been doing bird sits for at least 6 months, and they really understand those initial 5 voices of the birds. But after that happens, you can take it to this more advanced level. So number 1, sentinel. This is a really cool thing that is actually almost always happening around us. It's something that you can observe quite frequently. And this is where you'll have one bird who is kind of on watch duty. And they'll usually be on the tallest surface, whether that's the roof of a house or the tallest tree. And they will be kind of watching out for predators, while the rest of the birds in their flock or their extended flock can be feeding and conducting baseline behavior, knowing that this bird who's at the high point has their back, and knowing that if that bird lets out an alarm, that they will quickly scatter. But that as long as that bird is calm, they can continue to be calm and know that they're being watched after. The second one here, hook, is often when there is a ground predator, and the birds will move from the ground where they might be feeding or nesting or things like that, and they'll hook up into a bush or a tree to escape that predator. Another interesting thing to know about the birds is that they generally know exactly what their predator is capable of. So they might know that, the orange cat in the neighborhood can jump 4 feet high, but the gray cat in the neighborhood can jump 5 feet high. And they will move exactly as far away as they need to move, and not much farther, because birds, like most wildlife, really conserve energy. So that's kind of an interesting thing to know about them. Ditch, of course, is the opposite. If they notice an aerial predator like a Cooper's hawk, they will ditch down from the sky or the tree and hide on the ground or under the bushes, things like that. Bird plow is kind of a fun one. The kids always think that name is hilarious. And this generally comes up when someone is maybe jogging through the woods or moving quickly in a way that startles the birds. And birds, they communicate in a way that can create concentric rings. And this is another thing that you'll hear John Young talk about if you go into some of his works. But what happens, is the bird closest to the event that sets off the alarm will say, something to their peers to the effect of, hey, there's someone coming down the trail. And then the next bird who's, 10 yards down the trail will say, hey, there's someone coming. And it sort of creates these rings, like if you were to throw a pebble into a pond. And so what ends up happening is that all of the birds will move out from that area, and it'll just create a really big circle of, the birds escaping this fast moving potential predator. So that's a bird plow. And the fifth one here is mobbing. This generally occurs when a bird like a crow or a jay or potentially a hawk or another accipiter is trying to get nestlings as a snack. So you'll see several smaller birds chasing after a larger bird to scare them off. And usually that larger bird was trying to eat their babies. So that is something that's really cool to see. And often you'll see, maybe crows mobbing an eagle or things like that. Or you'll see a lot of smaller songbirds mobbing a crow. So that's a really fun thing to get to see, and something that you actually see quite commonly if you know what to look for. So whenever you see, two or more birds chasing after a larger bird, that's what you're looking at. So that's a really fun thing. So now that you have that kind of overview of, the different voices that you might hear of the birds, that kind of helps for this next process, because using those symbols can be really helpful for the kids to be able to tell a story as they become more experienced with this whole process of bird language, and they become more experienced with, they've now gotten the spectrogram style notes, they've now gotten the beginning, middle, and end process. So now you can take it up a level and really notice, what the birds are doing and really create a story out of it. So I'm going to put on this last virtual bird sit, and then I'm going to tell you a little bit of what you can do with that with your students. This is where it gets really juicy. So I'm very excited to share that. So here we are for the last virtual bird sit. we are. So, as a teacher, when you're conducting these bird sits with your class, it's really important to take your own notes as well, because that will inform your ability to ask them different questions at the end. Um, in this, I was able to set up the video to particularly focus on one species that I knew was going to make both song and alarm calls in the video. However, of course, in real life, you can't make such predictions, but what you can do is sit and observe the same thing that the kids are observing. And then you can ask questions based on that. So if you're hearing, a lot of songs from that bird and maybe only one or two alarms, which is what I observed in this particular instance, then you might ask the kids, oh, did anybody hear that Pacific slope flycatcher? And how did it sound? Did it seem like it was mostly happy or mostly scared? And at what point in the story did it express fear? You can kind of get to this deeper level of questioning with them, which is really fun. So make sure that you are taking those notes along with the kids, and that way you'll be able to ask them really great questions. Um, so with this level of soaring, so egg, hatchling, fledgling, soaring, now that you're here, this can get really fun, because what you can do is when the kids come back from their bird sit, you can actually make a map. And this is where the symbols become really important. So either using, one of those giant easel pieces of paper or a chalkboard or whatever, you have available to you, what you can do is make a map of the area where you were conducting that bird sit. So, say it's your schoolyard, and you could draw the playground over here and the parking lot over here. And maybe, there's a soccer field or something in the middle. And you can draw those main features, right? And then as you go through the what happened questions, you can add students' observations to the map. So you can say, okay, everybody, what happened during the beginning of the story? I tend to like to also use different colors of markers or different colors of chalk for this process. So say the beginning, you're going to only use the blue marker. And then anything that a student observed from the beginning section of the bird sit, you can add it to the map with that blue marker. So say they heard a chickadee alarming by the playground, then you could put an exclamation mark right next to the playground. You could even write chickadee or, CH to represent chickadee, or whatever seems right for your purposes. And then if they heard, nothing, silence. This is also a really important thing to pay attention to. If they heard silence in a particular area, you can add that to the map. If they heard, a song, you can add that little song symbol, and that makes it a lot easier to quickly record their information and make it into this sort of visual story. So then you'll get to the middle and you'll say, okay, in the middle section, I'm going to use the yellow pen, and you'll add everything that they heard there. And doing this is really fun because you can put together a whole picture of what happened. And sometimes, it's pretty average and the birds are just doing normal things and it doesn't lead to a particularly exciting story. But other times it can lead to an amazing discovery. If you've got some silence over here and then some bird alarms over here, and then, some bird songs over here, what you might become aware of is that there was a predator in this one particular part of your observation area. Or perhaps the bird alarms might move from one side of the schoolyard to the other. And perhaps, the chickadees are alarming near the soccer field at the beginning, and then in the middle they're alarming near the parking lot, and then at the end they're alarming near the playground. That could tell you that there's maybe a cat moving through the schoolyard. So being able to take all of the input from their different stories can actually create a really cool collective image of what's been happening. So I have a couple little maps to show you guys. These are ones that I've made with my students. Here are my wonderful students in the woods making a map. Very excited to share their information. And this little map shows, a lot of different symbols. It's got some dotted lines, which is what I usually use to represent a zone where there was silence. And as you can see, the kids all have their clipboards and their notes, and they're just eager to contribute what they have observed. Another kind of closer look at one of our maps. We have this one right here. And this little map has some fallen logs that were part of our territory. It's got some trees. It also has some individual letters that you can see here in pink that are representing where different students sat for the bird sit. This kind of just became features of our map as well, which depending on how many students you're working with could be really useful, or it could just be extremely time consuming. So, totally up to you whether you want to include that part. But we've got our territory kind of marked out here. And then in addition to, the symbols, we've also got some arrows to show movement. So right here, you've got this little swirly because there was one bird that was circling and then it flew straight over this way. You can see that little arrow pointing to it. We've got some song notes. We've also got a smiley face here to show that a bird was happy. We've got an alarm right over here with that exclamation mark. And so you can see, that these are represented in different colors as well. So we've got, one was blue and one was yellow and one was pink, all representing a beginning, middle, or end of the story. So what I want to show you next is actually my students discussing what they observed during this particular bird sit. And what you'll find about this discussion is that it's largely guided by my questions, but I'm also giving a lot of space for the students to kind of erupt in their own chatter if they're excited about something. So you'll see a little bit of that too. Also, you'll hear me encouraging them to imitate the bird calls because it brings it so much to life for them to imitate those calls and to learn the specifics of, what sounds individual birds might make. So here we are with part one of this discussion. Each one of these videos is just about a minute long. So get started with that. Oops, sorry, once again, shared the wrong one. Technology is not my strong suit. There we go. Okay. Dark-eyed junco and an exclamation mark. What does that mean? What sound did we hear?
Alarm.
Yeah, what does that sound like?
Sighting.
Can anyone do an example of the junco alarm? Yeah.
Dee, 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 dee.
Do juncos say chickadee-dee-dee?
No.
Asher did an example. Can you do that example again, Asher? Can anyone else make the sound Asher's making for junco? Yeah, that's what we heard. What about in yellow? What did we hear during period one? Yeah, we heard some chickadees. Yeah. Now here's the real question I have. For those of you who just heard the Cooper's hawk, point to what direction you heard it in. Now, what about where was the zone of silence on our map? Point on our map to where the zone of silence was. Yeah, in the top corner. And in real life, where is that?
Somewhere maybe over there.
Yeah, at the top of the hill, right? At the edge of Flicker Forest and Leaf Field? Yeah. Nice. That means...
It's like it was moving. That's what I heard.
Yeah?
That's what I heard.
Oh.
That might have been what I heard. That what you heard. I was sure. No, I'm not sure. Oh, that was the Cooper's hawk. That's what I heard.
I just love hearing them talk about the birds, especially when they get so excited like that. So, you might even notice that I was letting that discussion get completely interrupted by bird calls that were happening in the present. There was a Cooper's hawk that was flying by us, making that call that a lot of the kids were impersonating. And, allowing that to happen really makes that discussion so much more exciting for them. There's no reason to need to stay so on track that if a bird is, right there making a call while we're talking about birds, of course, we're going to interrupt the discussion and talk about that bird that just came by. and to allow the kids to have that discussion of, wait, is that what you heard? That's what I heard too. I think that's this. I think that's a Cooper's hawk or whatever. It's just so much fun. So I have one more little video just to show you of these discussions that we've been having with the kids. So here is another one. Oops, I'm sorry. This is the same video again. So I'm just going to skip that second video because I think you got the general idea here. But it's just so fun to have these discussions with them and to get to, watch their understanding unfold, and mostly to see them get so excited about it and excited to piece together these little mysteries and figure out, what was going on. It's just so incredible to see that happen. So I really hope that all of you have a chance to try this out with your students in some capacity. And I really hope that this webinar has kind of helped you feel like you have a starting place and that you might be wanting to try something like that with your students. I have quite a number of downloadable resources that I have created, and I'm going to have those available to all of you. So the easiest way to get them would be to go to birdswithbrooke.com and you'll be able to download all of them there. So there will be, a worksheet that the kids can use. There's a lesson plan with all of the 4 levels of this bird sit that we've talked about, including what standards it aligns with. There's also a packet listing every single Common Core standard that can be addressed through bird language that I've discovered so far. This is kindergarten through 3rd grade. And some tips and tricks about how to have a really successful bird sit with kids. So I hope that you'll go check out those resources and download them and use them as you see fit. And I hope that you have found this program to be fun and informational. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me. My email should be part of the, Prescott resources that you've gotten for this Summer Institute. But you can also contact me through my website, birdswithbrooke.com, or through Instagram or YouTube, which are both under the same name. In addition, if you would like to rewatch any of those virtual bird sits, those are all on my YouTube channel as well. So you can feel free to check those out. Thank you all so much for sharing your time with me. I hope you've enjoyed it, and take care. Thank you. Bye-bye.